Chapter 18 from The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet. The Angry Sea. About 9 o'clock that morning, long after Dr. Topman had started off on his round of calls despite the storm, David sat at the breakfast table in the nice warm kitchen, telling his mother the whole marvelous story. There she sat, her cup of coffee cooling unnoticed at her elbow, her toast grown quite cold and soggy. "And then?" she would cry. "And what did these enormous mushroom trees look like? I mean, exactly what did they look like? And do the people actually make their clothes out of mushrooms? And the Marinbun, or whatever he was he black or brown? Was he like a dinosaur? Did he have fur? No, but he was kind of like a huge, tremendous sloth. And Taw, what did he say? And then what did you say? And so what did you do then? And David, what about their houses? And were there birds? And so on and so on. And she was full of questions about the effect of that damp climate on the mushroom people, and about time on Basidium. Did it seem the same as here? And about the exact length of the day, and whether the mushroom people had invented the wheel yet or not, and whether they had beds or lay on the floor, and whether they had stoves, and what they used for pots and pans and dishes, and whether the children seemed kindly treated and well behaved. But then, she reminded herself, everyone was in the middle of a crisis, and so perhaps you couldn't really judge. Besides, being in such an awful hurry, added David, to get through the city and up on into the mountains. His mother gave a big sigh. Well, she said, in spite of being the parent of a spaceman who has just returned from a hitherto unknown satellite, I must do the dishes and make the beds. Oh dear. And she looked out of the window at the sodden landscape. Poor John and Mrs. Pennyfeather and the children. They'll be so hungry. It's letting up a bit, David. You simply must go out there and... But Mother! Exclaimed David in stunned surprise. I just got through telling you how we took Mrs. Pennyfeather to Basidium, and how if it hadn't been for her... There! Cried Mrs. Topman, clapping her hands to her head. You see what habit does? I clean forgot, just for a moment, about her being your mascot. You did take food along for her, I hope. Yes, Mom, replied David in a funny sort of voice, quiet and serious, with all the excitement gone out of it. We took a whole bag of feed, and by the time the feed's all used up, by then the time of new growth will be around again, and she'll have sulfur plants, or whatever else she can eat around the sulfur springs. Good, said Mrs. Topman, getting up and beginning to carry the dishes away from the table. But I do hope Mrs. Pennyfeather can eat sulfur plants, or find something there she likes, though there's no use worrying about it now. Even if she were to, well, you know, a hen can't last forever anyway. And the important thing, of course, was for the mushroom people to be saved. She hummed to herself and then went over to the radio. Wonder what the news is about the storm. I've been thinking about the fishing fleet, the wind and all. And she lifted her head to listen to it driving across the roof. But David said nothing, for all at once he had an awful sinking feeling that just maybe, in spite of herself, and in spite of everything she had said and all the questions she had asked, his mother actually believed the whole thing to have been a dream. And maybe even she wouldn't have been in the least surprised to find Mrs. Pennyfeather down in the chicken house this very minute. Mother, he began. Mother, tell me, would you be willing to go to Basidium if Mr. Bass didn't mind? At this, Mrs. Topman looked up and stared at him. Will you go, Mom? Will you? Then she smiled, an odd little smile. Why, yes, of course I'll go, David. But it's rather frightening, isn't it? Her eyes widened. Then her glance wavered and fell away. Of course, we'll go sometime. No, not sometime. Tonight. You and Mr. Bass. And we can take John and the children and more feed. Then I'd feel better. Oh, but she didn't believe. She didn't believe. He knew that. He could see it in her face. And she had to. He had to make her believe in some way, and he was about to put his proof to her step by step when the newscaster's rich, jovial voice suddenly filled the room. And here's a little item that's been giving us a great deal of amusement in the newsroom. A small boy phoned in a few minutes ago to tell us that this morning, very early, before the storm had gotten well underway, but after the big wind had already begun, he looked out of his window and saw a neighbor of his swooped up by the gale and whipped right off into the sky. Up and up he went, so the little boy said, turning this way and that, his coat flapping about his ears, until he finally vanished altogether, a mere speck in the clouds. Over the radio came the deep, hearty, jolly voice of the newscaster, relishing to the fullest this ridiculous story. Well, he finished, still chuckling, I guess there's just no telling what's going to happen around here. Some storm. Mrs. Topman turned, laughing. Isn't that funny, she said. Imagine. No, said David. I don't really think it's funny. And he turned and went off to his room to think. And the minute he got there, he remembered something. The necklace, he exclaimed aloud. Chuck's got it. Ta's necklace. That's it. When Chuck came over, he, David, would take his share of the stones and give them all to his mother. And then she would believe. And what was more, she and Captain Tom must come with them when they went to Mr. Base's for their appointment. He looked at the clock. He had 15 minutes before Chuck would arrive, so quickly he got into his rubber boots and raincoat and hurried down to the hen house. Already in the damp gray air, the young chickens were out pecking about for their breakfast, and over in one corner of the hen yard, John stood disconsolately with drooping, dirty tail feathers. Was it because his wife had left him, or had been so rudely snatched from him, that he looked such a miserably unhappy bird? Hastily, David threw handfuls of grain around, and it was remarkable, he thought, how much more cheerful John had become, even though, as he strutted hastily over, he still managed to carry his air of bereaved dignity. Now David went on down toward the end of the cypress hedge. There he'd have a good, uninterrupted view of the beach and could reassure himself at once that the spaceship, despite having been left out on the sand instead of being stowed carefully away in the cave, was still safe and sound. But what a terrible sight met his eyes! With a wildly beating heart, he searched that curving strip of dark sand, pounded by the huge breakers, for some sign of the ship, but it was gone. There was not a sign of it the whole length and breadth of the beach, at least as far as he could see. Oh, tired as they had been, why hadn't they put their ship away? Now he started to run. But even when he got past the row of cypresses and onto the beach itself, there was no spaceship. All that was left in its place was a scattering of wood and tin, and far up near the cave, one battered, soaked, torn-up old cushion. The cave itself was dark and damp and cold. There was no need to wonder what had happened. In the dim light of early morning, the roaring tide had come in, clawing and reaching with its strong gray fingers. It had dragged the spaceship close and fallen upon it and battered it, picked it up and hammered it on the rocks and the hard sand until there was nothing left but this sad scattering of debris flung far and wide up and down the shoreline. David's eyes blurred as he reached over to pick up a piece of tin. Yes, there were the little holes all around it, where he or Chuck had nailed it onto the long, curving body of the spaceship. And over a bit farther, he found the little spigot from the oxygen urn almost buried in the sand. His eyes were hot and stinging, but he blinked hard as he turned the spigot over and over in his fingers, then hid it away in his pocket. It really didn't matter about the ship, he told himself, but all the same, as he stared out over the churning water, he knew that just in this moment he hated the sea. It really didn't matter because there wasn't any reason why he and Chuck couldn't build another. Still, he knew somewhere inside himself that they couldn't. There had been something about that ship, something about the building of it, and about the journey it had taken them on, that could never happen again. Someday, when he was a man, he might have another spaceship and go on another journey, but it would not be such a journey as this had been, because he would be old then, and nothing would be the same. But what if Mr. Bass wanted them to go back? What if he asked them to get to work at once and build another ship? There was only one thing left to do now, and that was to go to Mr. Bass and tell him the whole thing. Perhaps Mr. Bass would be angry that they'd been so careless, for now his oxygen urn and his cylinders were gone. And if they were like his other inventions, he could never repeat them exactly again. But somehow, thought David, that was one thing you couldn't imagine, Mr. Bass being angry. He turned and ran up the beach, and when he came to his house, the back door opened and out stepped his mother and Captain Tom and Chuck, all ready to start. "They're coming too, Dave," shouted Chuck. "Is it all right, do you suppose? I thought it was time they met Mr. Bass." David came up to them slowly. "Yes," he said, "it's time they met him. They've got to, Chuck, so they can hear about Basidium from him. Captain Tom, did you think Chuck was telling you a whopper this morning?" Captain Tom grinned down sideways at Chuck, and Chuck kicked the toe of his shoe once or twice against the side of the porch. "Chuck," exclaimed David urgently, "the necklace! Show it to them! Just show it to them! Show it to my mom!" But now Chuck's face slowly changed and took on an expression of almost frightened surprise. "Why, Dave, I left it in the spaceship. I thought all this time you had it. Don't you remember when we were scrambling around for the bags of food so we could jump out quick and talk to Mr. Bass? The necklace dropped out of my pocket. It landed down on the oxygen urn, and you got out last, so I thought maybe you had it." All the urgency had faded from David's face. There was a long moment of utter silence. Then David shoved his hands in his pockets. "Well," he said in a voice that shook a little, "I haven't got it, that's all. The sea's got it, and the sea's got our spaceship too, and we'll never see either of them again." He turned away for a second and bit his lip hard. Then from his pocket he pulled out the spigot of the oxygen urn. "Here's all that's left." Chuck took the little spigot and turned it over in his fingers, just as David had done on the beach, while Captain Tom and Mrs. Topman gazed sadly at the two boys, without, apparently, being able to find a word of comfort. "Gone," muttered Chuck finally. "Both of them gone. What will Mr. Bass say?" But at this, Captain Tom put an arm across Chuck's shoulder. "There's no reason you can't build another ship, boys. I've had 2 ships go down under me, but I always got another." "Yes, but yours weren't spaceships, Grandpop," said Chuck in a low voice. "Yours weren't special ships with things in them nobody could ever make again. I just almost wish we'd never come back." At this, Captain Tom looked stern. "Seems to me we're getting in the doldrums here, and there's only one cure for that. We'll just have to go and get on over to this Mr. Bass's and see what he's got to tell. Look sharp now, men. We're underway." But no sooner was everyone settled in the car with Mrs. Topman at the wheel and the first block behind them than Chuck leaned forward all at once and touched her on the shoulder. "Let me out, will you, Mrs. Topman?" he said. "There's something I've got to see about, right away." Mrs. Topman drew over to the curb and turned and looked at Chuck in surprise. "Why, Chuck, what's the matter? Aren't you going to Mr. Bass's with us?" Chuck shook his head and set his lips in a way David knew, and his expression meant he wasn't going to be budged. "Nope, I'm not going," he said. "Got to see about something." So he hopped out, and nobody asked him any questions, because you could tell he didn't want to be asked any questions. He looked extremely serious, and the last they saw of him, he was going around the corner of David's house very fast.